LaTonya Wilkins, we are thrilled to have you with the community at Leadership Greater Washington. Welcome to the conversation. And I would love to first start out a little bit about you, because I know your grandmother played a significant role in your life and who you became before we get into psychological safety and how to lead our organizations and become below the surface leaders.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. First off, before I answer that question, I want to thank everybody for having me today. As Mehan had said, I do consider myself also a below the surface leader, and it's always great to connect with people below the surface that really want to take a close look at their leadership to think differently about the future. And so, as Mehan said, I did write a book called Leading Below the Surface, How to Build Real and Psychologically Safe Relationships with People Who Are Different from You. And the story behind that book, I'll start off with my background. So as was mentioned, I've worked, before I started Change Coaches, I had a traditional corporate career. And I started off as undergraduate. I ended up working in the nonprofit field, and then moving into for-profit. Then I went back to business school, which is a very traditional path, and came out of business school, and I worked in one of those big company leadership development programs, rotational programs. And so then I progressively continued. Since I started in a large company, I ended up pretty much staying in large companies until towards the end of my career, where I taught and I led culture at the Geese College of Business. But yeah, I worked for large consulting firms, large companies. And one of the things that I always stuck out to me in these large companies is that I never really felt like I belonged. And it was really interesting because when I was applying to these companies, they were always on these best companies lists and like the place that you want to be, the place you want to work. And then when I finally broke in, I was like, yes, I'm going to be in the best company. But it was never that way. No one would see me. No one would really talk to me. And then we would have these big DEI programs and departments, and they never benefited someone like me who these programs were for. And so one of the things that I always thought about and I always reflected on is, why is it so hard for people to build relationships with people who are different from them? Like in these corporations, we had these big programs. They wanted to, again, it was a lot of fluff. It was a lot of, performative actions, but there wasn't really anything that was embedded in our structures around how do we build real relationships with people who are different from us? How do we understand people who are different from us? And my grandmother was always someone who did that. And so she was always an inspiration. And I'll tell you a little bit more about her, but high level, she grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, migrated to the north due to Jim Crow laws, my mother not wanting to drink from a colored fountain. And regardless of all of that, she was still amazing with building relationships with people who are different from her, and taught me how to do that, infused that in all of us. And so that I was kind of bursting at the seams to get this out there, because again, I felt like organizations were going in the wrong direction and they weren't really focusing on what was important, which was building those relationships. So that's a little bit about me and the story behind Leading Below the Surface.
Yeah, I appreciate that, LaTonya, and I appreciate you mentioning the experience, partly because you look so young. It's almost like, everyone's like, LaTonya has all this experience. So you started early with a lot of business experience. But you also mentioned, LaTonya, you both worked for and you have worked with a lot of brand name organizations that over the years, many of them have spent a ton of time and money on diversity training and those types of initiatives, which at times we could argue have been counterproductive.
Mm-hmm.
So you talk about a different approach and different kind of thinking to really have those open communications and relate to people who are different from us. How is it different than what a lot of organizations have done over the years, and many even post George Floyd's murder started rolling out similar initiatives to what had been done in the past?
That's a good question. So I also run a company called Change Coaches. So basically, after I put Leading Below the Surface out there, I was already, I'd become a coach before that. And I wanted to really coach people to make real change in the workplace. And when I went completely out there on my own, started bringing in coaches, I was still seeing that the diversity and inclusion field, although we aren't necessarily just diversity and inclusion focused. I mean, we're culture focused, but a lot of people put it on that. But I was seeing that that field was still very much based on compliance, telling people what to do, shaming, like, making people feel bad about what they're doing. And, I get it. I get that people are saying, hey, people have to know and, how we're feeling. And I felt that too in 2020 when it was, blown open what racism really is like, right? What racism really looks like in the United States. And also, before that, there were times, big events where you could see what homophobia really looks like hate really looks like. And so being able to see that, and then after that, I started seeing a lot of people talking about how not to hate. And here's some steps how not to hate, or here's a training you need to go through, or and again, the structures and systems are good, but when you look at the research, people don't like to be told what to do. And another thing, when you look at the research is, and as a coach, this comes naturally to me, everybody wants a role in this. And what I was seeing is, again, this was being run by one department, and everyone didn't have a role. Everybody, no matter, white men need a role in this, Black women need a role in this, brown people need a role in this, queer people need a role in this. And so I was still seeing that these programs, it's one person and pushing out. And so, with this, a lot of times when we're coaching executive teams, we tell people to hold off on hiring a chief diversity officer because those jobs just overall aren't very successful. They're getting more successful, but overall, you could look at the research, and you might be mad at me for saying this, but it's true. Those jobs are not overly successful and it's not their fault. It's just that they haven't been set up for success. So what do we do differently? Well, we focus on long-term behavioral, structural, and systems change. And usually, for example, for working with a smaller to mid-sized company, we'll start with team coaching with the executive team, and then doing that for a prolonged period of time, also throwing in some workshops, some hands-on workshops around, how to build a culture of belonging, what this looks like. How do you build real relationships? How do you know when people are belonging? Like, what is the dominant leadership standard? I talk a lot about this in my book. And dominant leadership standard means it's basically all the ideas in the past that just don't work. And people get mad at me when I talk about this. But one of those things is meritocracy, right? We talk about meritocracy, survival of the fittest, like, the best performers will rise. But guess what? Those systems they don't work. And I talk about this in my book. People so upset, but that's why we have to start with these executive teams a lot of the times to really help reprogram how they think about leadership. This is part of leadership. That's what's different. We don't talk about it as DEI. This is separate. It's like, all right, now that we have a new workplace, you have to think differently about your leadership. That includes multi-generational workplaces. That includes having, Gen Z in the workplace. The way that they communicate is different. We all know that. It's not good or bad. It's different. We have to adjust. We're going to have more people of color in the workplace. We have virtual work. How do we make sure that people belong? So that's how we do it. A lot of times we start at that level, and then we work our way down. Sometimes we might even start with a DEI task force, like a group of executives that are kind of coming together to figure this out. And then we work our way out. But those are a couple of ways, but it always begins with coaching, reprogramming, and, within the behavior structures and systems.
And LaTonya, to lead below the surface, I want to underline a point that you made. A lot of times when we try to change people's views of things, there is a heuristic where there is that backfire effect.
Yeah.
people end up becoming more convinced of their original view. So a lot of times forcing people into the traditional approaches of training can cause a lot of backfire, if anything.
Right.
So
Mhm.
David McRaney has written an outstanding book also, How Minds Change. And part of the key points he makes is very similar in that there has to be much more conversation and much more listening, telling people things. And there is lots of data on this, lots of research projects on it. Shoving information at people, all kinds of data at people, makes them more convinced of their original
Mm.
point of view. So you advocate for more conversation and mention the word psychological safety that
Yeah.
has almost become a buzzword. So I want to understand, what is a psychologically safe environment that therefore allows for people of all colors, all backgrounds, to feel comfortable in engaging in these conversations?
Yeah. So I'm going to tackle this in a couple of different ways. Let me write this down so I don't forget. So psychological safety, I'll come back to and what that looks like. But I also want to talk about a really important point you made about changing opinions and how this can backfire. So I was doing a talk like a couple weeks ago. I was on vacation finally for the last week, but and it was really interesting because it was a talk about coaching people who are different from you. And in my back channels, this happens every time. I give some vulnerable examples of people different from me that I coached, and I wasn't sure what I could say to not encroach on their privacy. And I've learned how to do that over the years. But the back channels are always full of, what if my political views are different? And I'm like, wait, this is not what we're talking about, right? And so some of you are probably like, maybe that's what we are talking about, but it's really not. What we're talking about is, how do you build relationships with people who are different from you? How do you get to know them? How do you connect with them? And, in organizations, political views usually are not one of those things that you really bring in. I mean, you could bring that in later, but it's one of those things that sometimes we start with or we jump to. But think about all the other things you could jump to before that, right? Because we get so caught up on changing people's opinions or politics or how they think, but that's not what this is about. It's about connecting people and seeking to understand. So how do we create psychological safety when you are seeking to understand? So a lot of the people that I coach, I don't ask, I don't know, because again, it's not really relevant. They probably have different views from me. They probably see the world differently from me. It's to be expected. They're different from me. And so in order to explore, how to create a culture of belonging where people can bring parts of themselves to work that are important, that make them feel seen, heard, and engaged, is that we have to be okay when they're making mistakes. We have to be okay when they're voicing something that's against the grain, right? That's against what everybody else thinks. We have to be careful when someone comes at me, for example, to create psychological safety. Sometimes when I'm doing these talks, I might be attacked. And if someone's attacking me or if I'm feeling personally attacked, I'm still going to make myself feel psychologically safe while making them feel psychologically safe. And usually in those, my reaction to that is I'll usually ask a question. I'll throw it back at them. If they're arguing with me and trying to prove me wrong, I'll throw a question back at them and I'll create that safety for them to challenge me. And when I that's a way to create that safety. So again, psychological safety, being able to make mistakes, being able to bring your whole self to a conversation without any repercussions or judgment. Another really important thing that I'll bring up before the next question is psychological safety is so important, especially when you're making large scale change. And again, there might be people that are not in power that are against that change or don't really like that change or not involved in that change. You have to give them an opportunity to speak up, even if you don't like it, even if it's like, some leaders say to me, like, we're doing this change anyways. So why would I ask them? I'm not going to change anything. Well, you give them an opportunity to speak up and show them that they're not going to be punished. Show them that their voice is there. And one thing you could say is, thank you for sharing that. And, and I'll see what I could do about it. But you don't have to burn it down every single time that you hear it. So hopefully that's a good overview. But again, going back to the difference, this psychological safety is not about changing people's opinions or minds. It's really about creating an environment that's safe for people to express themselves. And I'll say in a respectful way, right? Not, there's physical safety that comes into this as well when you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So sometimes people are like, well, is it psychological? What if is it psychologically safe, or is psychological safety about a racist bringing up with how they feel? That's not what it's about, right? It's really about doing this also in a respectful way and making sure that we have the basics on that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and one of those is physical safety.
Yeah, so as you talk about this, LaTonya, I think about many of the organizations that I interact with and some of the teams that I coach. And one way I think about it is, what is the delta between what people say individually and what they say when they are in a group? And
Right.
in vast majority of cases, when I talk to managers and senior leaders, they always think there is very high level of psychological safety. They say, and with me, people can be comfortable. With us, people can be comfortable. However, the conversations, whether when the individual team members have with each other or the individual team members at times have with me, is drastically different than the conversation that people are able to have as a group. So a psychologically safe environment, in a respectful way, people can have those conversations in the group rather than whether the virtual water cooler versions of it or with someone on the outside. So it is that below the surface self also exhibiting itself in the group environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really like that, that delta that you talked about, because it's sometimes when you're talking about psychological safety and you're talking about it in a basic way, it's like, are people speaking at all? Right? Like when you have a team meeting, are they speaking? But then when you get to the more advanced level, it's, are they telling the truth? Right? Are they really bringing their whole self and all their skill sets to tell the truth? And and the delta in the middle of that, or in the middle of there, it's are they gossiping? And if you're a manager, that when people are gossiping, and if they're gossiping and not bringing it to you, then you're lacking psychological safety, and there's some change that you need to make.
So with respect to psychological safety, one of the challenges that I see, LaTonya, with teams, including I serve on a bunch of different boards, and I think this relates to people that serve on boards of directors. There is very little challenger safety in that the conversations, sometimes people misunderstand psychological safety as everyone being safe to be nice with each other, while real psychological safety requires a level of challenging, enough respect where we can challenge each other and be our authentic selves. So, with your experience and your thoughts, how can teams, whether teams within organizations or boards, develop a level of safety where there can be challenger safety so there is high intellectual friction?
Hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. That is a very big challenge. I'm so glad you brought this up. So, we coach a lot of executive teams, and the issue that I see with this along this topic is when you have differences in people, like differences in race, gender, especially at the executive team, you're going to see a lot of men that have power, especially white men. And then you're going to have some other people of color, women kind of sprinkled in there. And so the executive team is going to be mostly white men. This is in general. Yours, if your organization's different, great. We want to see that. But I'm talking generalities here. And then there's going to be a couple of people who are different. So what I see happening, and let me tell you about what I see happening, and then we'll talk about psychological safety and some things that we've done around this. But what I see happening is when there is that intellectual challenge, the people that are over here, like that 10% people of color, women, queer folks, whatever, they're seeing that challenge as sexism, racism, privilege. And they're seeing that person on a higher pedestal. And it's a terrible feeling to have, but a lot of times it's true, right? I'm not saying it's the isms, but I'm saying that with the CEOs I coach, a lot of times when I ask them, who do you call when you need to expand? Who do you call when you're having a big issue? They always are calling those white guys, and they don't even realize it. Even women CEOs, that's who they're calling. And it's usually that's who they trust. And it's unconscious bias, and they don't even realize it until they're challenged on it, right? And so how do we create psychological safety? Well, I think you have to allow people to express that perception of this differential treatment. And it's easy to get defensive. Again, it may not be the isms, but people might think it's that. But it's hearing that and acknowledging what they're actually perceiving instead of the isms of it. Like, I don't want to be called a racist. What are you talking about? We're not racist. I'm not this. I'm not that. But it's the imbalance of power that you've got to be able to let people speak up about and talk about and explore. And that's so hard for teams. I will tell you, that's the first step, though, is letting people be able to speak up about that. And then once they speak up about that, if you are the leader of that team, exploring that power and balance as a team. And that's how you're creating that psychological safety, because you're listening to people. And you're not just minimizing them and saying, okay, this is not an issue. This is not an issue. So again, don't focus on the isms, focus on the grain of truth of what's that power and balance. And that's part of equity too, right? So don't think you're not being inequitable if you're focusing on the power itself. Equity is power, but like when you have a lack of power or power imbalance, that is equity. That's an equity issue. So that's what I would say is when people speak up, showing that you're hearing them and that it's something that you'll want to explore, even if it makes you uncomfortable, even if there's an uncomfortable truth, and you are perpetuating some of that.
And one of the things I know you also highlight in your book is some of the frameworks and some of the basis for this needs to be laid, the foundation in the person-to-person relationships before in that group setting. So you also talk about person-to-belonging listening rather than just person-to-person listening. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that and how we can do that well?
Yeah. So I think most of you here are leading in some way, leading teams, doing some sort of thing. So think about yourself as a leader and how you approach meetings, right? How you approach your interactions. So many of you, when you're thinking about that, and this is not a gotcha, right? But many of you, when you're thinking about that, you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, I have to get an agenda. I have to structure this meeting. I have to make sure that we make the most of our time. I have to make sure that I manage this tightly. Like you're thinking of your role as a leader to manage the flow. And sometimes that's important. But the thing that I'll challenge you on with that is when you're thinking too much about that and you're thinking too much about the details of, oh my gosh, I have to control how this goes, you're losing track of who's in the room. You're losing track of your team interactions. You're losing track of, just observing what's going on. And that's what person to belonging listening is. And it's what a lot of, we just don't do it well sometimes as leaders. And what that means is instead of you trying to tighten up the meeting, make sure you manage every crevice, you're going into the meeting and you're just observing. And I encourage you to do this even once a month, where you just take a back seat and you're observing, hey, how are these two people interacting? Like, let's go back to that example where some of these folks were feeling like there's an imbalance of power. And even though they all have the same title, there's an imbalance of power. If you sat back as a leader and you just observed, you probably observed there is an imbalance of power. Are people talking over each other? Are there introverts in the group that are or people of a different culture that are quieter? Are they getting airtime? If there are those people, are you sending out, requests before the meeting? Or are you just tailoring the meeting to, American men that, American men, they're going to jump in and speak up more right away. But a lot of people in other cultures don't think on their feet, and that's okay, right? They're probably brilliant, but they need to have that information. They need to prepare. They need to think about it before. So that's what person of belonging listening is. It's like, and the magic of that is when you're doing that, you can really see who belongs, who doesn't belong, where are the power dynamics, what does this look like? But if you're going in, you're trying to manage every crevice, you're not going to be able to connect with that.
I love that, LaTonya. And actually, I had a CEO do that with his senior team. The first couple of times, people were really thrown off. They were like,
that's what people
like,
are afraid of.
What is this?
Right.
He is not talking. He's not. And I know it was hard for him too, but what it allows people to do, and I would encourage everyone to think about this and act on it. Take a couple of meetings and don't lead the meeting. Don't participate in the meeting. Be an observer of this and do some person to belonging listening. And that can have a significant impact, because part of what we are always trying to do is optimize the process, the system, the time flow, that all of these things. And that is when we end up making mistakes in terms of creating a psychological safe environment where everyone can sense a greater sense of belonging.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great example, because whenever I bring this up, people are like, my team is going to look at me like I'm crazy. Like they're going to, and it's a very vulnerable moment. I mean, I acknowledge that. It's, silence is so powerful, but it's also very vulnerable. And sometimes when you are having a situation where you don't know what to say next, or it's getting tense, sometimes silence is the best solution, but it's a vulnerable solution too, because you're like, all right, they're going to step all over me. So what? It's not even about that.
So, LaTonya, you also talk about real leadership. Real as an acronym. What's real leadership, and how can we become below the surface leaders by becoming real leaders?
Yeah. So one of the things that I did in corporate, in my longer term corporate career, was I led leadership development and talent teams. And so I was very, very familiar with developing leadership development programs. And I also had been through a lot of leadership development programs. And one of the things that the backbone of all these programs, one of the things that this was based on, were leadership archetypes, right? All of us have heard of leadership archetypes. And, it's like, hey, you're strategic, or you're innovative, or you're whatever, charismatic. And we have all these archetypes. But, I got really frustrated with these archetypes, because I was like, so what if you're a strategic leader? You could be a strategic narcissist. Like, does that really do anything? And it's so interesting. And I'm sure too, all the CEOs that still come to me and say, they're not strategic. I'm like, come on, but that's a piece of this. But what else? What really matters is, how you treat people. And there weren't a lot of archetypes out there about that. Yeah, we had inclusive leadership, but that still felt a little watered down when you think about it. And it was like a side dish. It wasn't a main dish. And so when I was writing Leading Below Surface, before I started it, I did a lot of research on archetypes. And when I was at Geese College Business, and one of the things that I saw is that, again, there wasn't really an archetype for how we treat people. So that's where real leadership came from. So I looked into, all of the qualities that make a successful leader, and especially a successful leader in today's environment, in today's diverse environment, today's virtual environment. And what I found was real leadership, and that's the acronym. So relatable. So real leaders are relatable, which means that they find ways to relate to different types of people. I kind of joke about this sometimes when we think about Gen Z. They share a lot. I have Gen Zs that I work with, and one told me like a whole story about him and his girlfriend breaking up and getting back together, and it's a whole different generation, right? And it's fine. It's fine. It's just, you just got to be relatable, right? It's just like with anything else. You just know, whenever I talk to this person, I know that there's going to need to be a lot of personal interaction. That's relatability. You just know it. You just deal with it. It's okay. It's going to be different from, if I'm talking to a baby boomer, they're going to be tight. They're just going to want to get to different people. So relatable is the first one. Equitable. So equity was never within any leadership archetype. And so equity, when I talk about equity in Leading Below Surface, I'm talking about access, giving people access to you, giving people access to the resources they need, giving people access to power. And we talked about that today. So there's a lot around that. Awareness, not just being aware with 360s and all of that, but being aware of your team, using person to belonging listening to see who's belonging, who's not, having an awareness about your team culture and how people interact. A lot of times people come to me and they're like, I need to change my team culture. I don't know what it is. Well, do some listening, do some person belonging listening, and you'll find out it quickly. All right. So then loyalty. Loyalty is kind of adjacent to psychological safety. What it means is, you do let people make mistakes. Mistakes are assumed to be part of business, but it also means that you're going to hire different types of people on your team, especially now. There's a big push to hire diversity. There's a big push to hire people that are different from you. Guess what? When you hire these people that are different from you, there's a couple things that are going to happen that we don't like to talk about. One, you're going to have more conflict. You are. If you bring someone in different, it's going to be conflict, right? It's how it goes, right? The second thing is they're probably going to do things differently than you expected. It's how it goes, right? And so those are the realities. And so you have to have loyalty to the process of change. And the loyalty is, it means that you don't just fire the person or think you made a mistake because the person's doing something different, or think, oh no, this person's ruining my team. They're not. That's completely normal when there's going to be conflict. And again, you got to create that psychological safety for the conflict. You got to create that environment for the conflict. And that's what loyalty is. So again, relatable, equitable, aware, and loyal.
Yeah, I love that, LaTonya. And in part, as you're talking about that loyalty, it's being loyal enough to enable diversity of voices, not just diversity of faces, because sometimes organizations have focused on diversity, but it's diversity of faces of people with identical backgrounds that fit into a certain mold. Then they think we have diversity without having diversity of voices, which, as you say, requires sticking to the process rather than the old traditional approaches.
Right. Yeah, you stick to it, and stick with it and see what happens. And I'm talking about this stuff like it's easy. It's not, because you're bringing in someone, and especially in these high level positions, there's a lot of risk. But that's how you change your culture for the long haul is, again, challenging the structures and systems, accepting the conflict. There might be a dip in productivity for a minute while you're getting this person acclimated. But if you're loyal to the process, you'll have some longer term change.
LaTonya, you also mentioned awareness, and that's one of the challenges that I consistently see with leaders in that, especially as they move up in organizations, they tend to think they don't have blind spots, but I tend to view that their blind spots end up growing. So their awareness becomes less. So the leaders that are watching, listening to this conversation, what can they do to increase their awareness and reduce their blind spots? Because at this point, I imagine they're all thinking, well, no, blind spots is for my manager or for the person I work with. I'm pretty good. I would challenge them that no, we are not. So what can we do to reduce our blind spots?
Yeah. So the number one thing I would say is spending more time listening than you're talking. And, I could say that, yeah, go do an assessment, ask your team, but it's so much more powerful when you kind of change that balance and you are just observing how people are responding to you. You are observing, the faces, the facial expressions that people make. That's how you see how you're perceived, right? An example of that, when I challenged one of my CEO coaches to do this, what they found through this activity is that their team was always waiting for them to make the decision. And when they were able to get quiet and kind of throw some things back out to them, they learned that. They were like, wow, and this person had always gotten really great reviews on their 360s and all of that. But there's some things that you can't get from those canned assessments. And when they started doing that, they were able to see, wow, this is the process that I've built. And this is what this looks like. I would say if you want assessments, there's the IAT you can take, which measures your unconscious bias. There's also the IDI that measures your unconscious bias. But I think for many people, like the untapped one is the old-fashioned way, and seeing how people respond to you and seeing, how you might be how you might be impacting people. One more thing, and I think I told this story early on, but if you think that you don't have bias, we all do. I do too. But again, write down the top 5 people that you call when you are having an issue at work, or if you're a leader, the top 5 people that you depend on for problem solving. And 80% of the time, those people will look just like you. So that's another litmus test to see where you are. And again, no shaming here. It's the awareness. And once you are aware of that, then you know how to change.
Yeah, and that's a big point of it, continually raising that awareness. And the point that you make, LaTonya, it comes from that deep listening and observation,
Mhm.
which I find a lot of times people in leadership roles feel like they don't have the time for, but you
Right.
have to make the time to become a below the surface leader. The other thing you talk about, there are hundreds of biases, but there are 3 that you emphasize that we need to understand in order to become below the surface leaders. Would love for you to briefly touch on affinity bias, confirmation bias, and in-group bias, and the role they play in leading below the surface.
Yeah. So the terrible 3, again, lots of different biases out there, and we can get really overwhelmed when we think about biases. And so when I narrowed it down to the top 3 biases that I see that impact, people building real relationships and also decision making. So the first one is affinity bias, and affinity bias is when we want to be around people who are just like us, and it's just how we are. Like, think about it. It's, sometimes it helps us, right? So maybe you're a parent, for example, and there's parents groups, and you go to the parents groups, and maybe on your team, you look out for parents more, right? Because, as a parent, how parents are treated. But there's a downside to that, right? Like, what about the non-parents? There was a company I work with, this might sound silly, but they were in Seattle. And so there was a group of trekkers and hikers that basically got ahead in the organization because few of the executives were trekkers and hikers. And so there was affinity bias with that, with trekkers and hikers were getting promoted and people that weren't trekkers and hikers were not. And so it's like, it could get as simple as that. Obviously there's race and gender, but I'm giving you some of those that may not be as obvious to you, because you may be thinking, oh, I'm okay, I don't have affinity bias. Well, you probably do, and we all do, and it's around those things. The second bias is in-group bias. So in-group bias can be very evil within organizations. It could be very destructive. And in-group bias means that you have your group. So going back to the hikers are together. They think they're the greatest team. They think they are the most prepared for the future. But everybody that's not a hiker, ooh, they're lazy. They're not great. All right. So that's in-group bias. The scary thing about in-group bias is people that are in the in-group can't even have basic empathy for the out-group. And so you want to really, really, keep an eye on this. Third,
LaTonya, let me jump in there for 1 second, because I know in the conversations I have with people, a lot of times we minimize these biases on ourselves. And it is, again, whether it is giving people shirts of different colors, or saying people whose names begin with the certain letter, there is in-group bias. Like there are studies on in-group bias. I can right now take the people listening to this conversation or watching the conversation, give one group yellow shirts, one group red shirts, and in 5 minutes, there will be differences that they will perceive, and connection that the yellow shirts will have versus the red shirts. So we all are subject to these biases. So one of the things I want to encourage people to do is not to discount it. We just need to become more aware of it in order to be able to overcome it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is so important with the shirts. So, there's the whole Manchester United study, and where if someone even had a different jersey on and they needed some help, people would just walk right past them if they didn't have the same team or if they weren't fans of the same team. And so, there are lots of profound studies. A study that we all were a part of is our politics, right? Elections, right? And think about that. Like when you're talking to people and there's an in-group and an out-group, right? And it's like, you can't even have empathy. Like if you don't think like me, I can't even have empathy for you. And so that's how dangerous in-group bias gets. I see it a lot, as Mehan said, I see it a lot with teams like, oh, this is the all-star team, right? This team, generated the most revenues. And so then they're going to get their egos are going to soar, and then they're going to get in-group bias. And I don't know why orgs are still doing this, but they are. This is still happening at really, really profound levels where there is the team of the year. And again, I get the recognition, but be very careful if you're doing programs like that. And question if is that inclusive? I don't know. So think about that. And the third is confirmation bias. And again, that goes back to, I hired this person that was different. I knew it. I knew they weren't going to fit in. And then that kind of interconnects again, adjacent to the loyalty that we talked about a little bit earlier.
Yeah, so those biases play a big role as we all try to lead. And again, part of the point that you make, LaTonya, and I want to underline, is awareness plays a huge role. So the challenge I want to throw that out to everyone is to increase our awareness. This is not something that other people face. Every single one of us, every single day, face it. We have these biases, we have these challenges, and have to overcome them. So you see your book as a self-coaching tool, which is great, and I see it as a self-coaching tool. What would be some self-coaching thoughts to the group in order for them to become more below the surface leaders? So if you were to say, here is some self-coaching you should do to become more below the surface, what recommendations would you have?
Yeah, so in the book, I talk about real leadership, and I have some questions in there. I would start there with the real leadership measure. That's a great, easy, quick and dirty measuring stick. So, relatable, So let's start with relatable. So, how relatable are you to different types of people? Are you adjusting? Are you judging instead of adjusting to the different types of styles? Remember, I gave the Gen Z example. It's frustrating. It could be frustrating for you, but are you being different with different types of people? And just asking yourself these questions. How equitable are you? Like, how equitable is your team? How equitable are your team structures? Who has access to you? Who has the power? And again, you got to figure this out through the person of belonging listening. Aware, how aware are you of, your leadership, and what does that look like? And, how much are you talking versus listening? How much are you letting yourself kind of connect to that awareness and let that awareness simmer up so you can see it, right? And then loyal, how loyal are you to new people, to new processes, to new systems? Are you the kind of leader that's just like, wait, I'm going to try this out for a month. If it doesn't work, I'm going to move on. Are you the kind of leader that sticks with it through the long haul? Are you thinking about, change as a fad, like, right? 2020 fad of, okay, now we're going to get into the fads like anti-racism or whatever. Or are you thinking about this on a long-term basis, right? Where it's going to be hard. You're going to make some missteps. You don't know everything. I don't know everything. So every year you're learning everything. You're not checking a box and saying, okay, we've got our anti-racism stuff or we got our diversity stuff in place, so now we're good. So that's what loyalty is. It's loyalty to the turns in the road and that long road. And sometimes it's going to be uphill, sometimes it's going to be downhill. And there's going to be seasons to that. So that's the quickest way, I would say, is just go through those qualities and just see how real you are. And then that's how you start.
And that's a great way for us to get started with ourselves, real leadership that you mentioned. And again, it's an ongoing process. So one final question for you, LaTonya, before wrapping this up, is that sometimes people share frustrations with me with respect to, I'm working on myself, I get it. However, then they say the team, the organization, the broader environment that I operate in needs to change. Any thoughts with respect to how we can bring more below the surface leadership to our teams and our organizations?
Yeah, I think the big thing is, again, challenging the heart of how you lead and how your organization defines leadership, right? And first thinking about what does leadership look like? Like, is it, just skills? Or are we really thinking about truly connecting with people who are different from us and doing that on a regular basis? Moving away from the check boxes. And so that's how I would say, because a lot of times, like when we're thinking about our teams, and we do this work a lot because we'll start with executive teams and then kind of go throughout the organization and help them kind of challenge them to think about this differently. But it's really thinking about, how they can think differently, or your direct reports can think differently about leadership. And so instead of sending them to, like, again, a strategic leader summit, send them to something else that, again, is challenging the way that they think about leadership today, and less about that dominant leadership standard that we're kind of growing out of, right? There's new problems, new approaches. And so moving them towards that new approach. I think the second is coaching and evaluating. I don't want to say evaluating yet, but that's going to be down the road. I'm not going to focus on that today, but that's a structure that you need. But coaching, again, based on those newer skills, those different skills that are important today, as part of leadership, not like a DEI initiative.
Yeah, and that can continue helping us get better. As you say, these are not initiatives, and part of what I know you also talk about in the book and is important to you is much more listening sessions and conversations
Mm-hmm.
rather than DNI training sessions and all of those things, which have been in some instances even counterproductive to the cause. So I really appreciate you joining the conversation. There are a couple of things I'm going to ask. First of all, Rebecca, to put a couple of links in the in chat. Rebecca, one, we would really appreciate for you guys to take a minute and do Survey Monkey, give us feedback on this session. Also, one of the things is Mark Burgell is launching his Shared Humanity project. He is the outstanding sponsor of these conversations. I'm going to ask Rebecca to put in chat the link to Mark's website. Poverty is one of those issues that we all think something should be done about, and we think it's important enough priority. However, a lot of us don't really know what we can do specifically with respect to our communities and in ways we can impact it. Mark has built an organization and put together a website as a part of that that can show you clearly where, how you can engage to make a difference. And if each and every one of us engage as community leaders, we can make that difference. And part of what I love is we can do that as below the surface leaders. LaTonya Wilkins, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights from your outstanding book, Leading Below the Surface, with the Leadership Greater Washington community, and look forward to seeing you in person in DC. LaTonya is in Chicago. We won't hold that against you. In group bias, DC, DC region. So we look forward to seeing you in person here and appreciate you taking the conversation below the surface. The external elements to the conversation at times have been counterproductive. Listen to what LaTonya has to say. I think her brilliant advice, both in her book and in her work in coaching, is truly impactful for us to lead below the surface. Thank you all for joining. Thank you so much, LaTonya Wilkins.
Great. Thanks for having me today.
See you all.